Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
It's about 4 minutes to 12 here. Big Ben is there. It's a glorious sunny winter's morning, and even through the scaffolding, the clock face is shining through. Prime Minister's questions coming up in a couple of minutes, and we're joined by John Pienaar today. John, good to see you back on the programme. I assume, given that it involves public sector contracts, outsourcing, all that sort of thing, that Mr Corbyn has no choice but to go on Carillion.
Oh, I think he sees this as an opportunity. I mean, he was describing it the other evening on a social media video as a watershed moment. That's certainly how they see it. Potentially, in their hopes around Jeremy Corbyn, a turning point in the argument, where they start to turn the tide of the argument against the role of the private sector in its present form in the services of the state, in the service of the state. It could be interesting, although I'm always hesitant to say that Prime Minister's questions is going to be interesting.
Indeed, these days, that's quite a bold statement.
It can be. But we will see, won't we, some sort of version of the game, where does the buck stop? Although in this case, it's not just a question of what are the answers, but what are the questions? Because the government ministers are saying they will learn the lessons of the Carillion affair. What will those lessons be? Are we talking about greater safeguards, a more clearer and better system of warning lights for a company like Carillion? But are there inbuilt weaknesses in this system which simply can't be ironed out? Is Carillion an inevitable consequence of a system that needs winners and losers? Or should it be changed? Or are those two questions simply compatible anyway?
Does the government have a clear line on this yet?
The government is in a difficult corner on this. They have been operating a system which involves substantial use of private firms in the construction of infrastructure and the delivery of services for many, many years, going back through past Labour governments under Gordon Brown and Tony Blair. That's all by the way now, because we've now got a new leader. We can forget about BC, before Corbyn, as far as this argument goes. You've got an ideological split as wide, or maybe wider, than anything we've seen since Margaret Thatcher set out to roll back the frontiers of the state back in the early 1980s. And we'll see how that pans out. It's tough for the government, lots of inquiries on the way. A couple of them in Parliament are going to be taking place in two committee rooms, probably at the same time at a certain stage, and they will lead to changes, but how fundamental?
The government must feel on the defensive on this.
I think they must, because when you see such a high-profile failure, when you see thousands of workers, public sector workers in doubt about their future, private sector workers with some certainty that their futures are in deep question. When you talk about lots of government money on the line, but we don't know how much, there are questions that are difficult and other questions they simply can't answer. So it's going to test Theresa May today.
Meanwhile, Brexit continues to trundle along in terms of the negotiations.
Or not.
Carillion, in a sense, in a way, we should all be grateful to Carillion, because it's actually given us something else to talk about, even if there are bad consequences to it, which is a reason for not being grateful. But it looks like, is the European Union on a kind of charm offensive with us at the moment?
It's possible to overdo what Donald Tusk said the other day.
Which we do.
Which we do, because that's what we do. In the same way that we sort of, part of that one lobe of our brain kind of enjoys this stuff, another part understands fully it's too serious for that. But when it comes to Donald Tusk, the European Council President, the other day saying, look, we hate to see you go, we just wish you would come back. We know that he thinks that, when he's going to go on thinking that. Him saying that does not make it necessarily any more likely, beyond getting up the noses of Brexiteers.
Yeah, which he succeeded in doing.
He probably doesn't mind that too much.
There was a surprise when he managed that. Am I right in thinking that the next stage of the talks is not about our actual future relationship with the EU, but we're going to talk first about the transition period following March 2019.
That's right. Until through the spring, we're supposed to be talking about the divorce and the transition period. These things are crucial. The transition in particular, moving from being a member to being not a member and avoiding terrible disruption. That's what this is about. The government is committed, as we know, to a time period of maybe a couple of years, this argument that says it's going to need a great deal more than that. And the details, well, we're just in the beginning of tying up a lot of those details.
Meanwhile, for governments, it usually never rains, but it pours. There's BBC story this morning about the huge number of nurses now just leaving the NHS, including, I understand, John, younger nurses who probably haven't completed their training all that long ago.
No,
but they've just decided, after having gone through all that training, that they don't want to be in the NHS.
No, that's so, and this is layered on top of the winter crisis, as we call it, just about every winter. People like the Royal College of Nursing have been worried about a recruitment crisis, as they would call it, in the NHS for many a month and actually a number of years. And it's being argued that Brexit has contributed to that the numbers of nurses from European countries that have been part of the workforce for a while is also beginning to dry up, and the effects are certainly being felt.
And it puts pressure, does it not? I hear rumblings, even on the Tory backbenches, indeed even Jacob Rees-Mogg, who you might not think would be on the progressive wing of the Tories on this, saying the government's going to have to come up with more money.
Oh, sure. I mean, you're hearing this, interestingly, from various quarters now. We're seeing senior Conservative voices, including the chairman of the 1922 backbenchers, the leader of the tribal elders of the Tory party at Westminster, talking about the possibility, let's look at hypothecated taxation, perhaps, earmarked taxes. Either way, there's a recognition that crosses party lines now that a long-term look at NHS funding means going places that we have not politically been willing to go before, and certainly with a lot more money being discussed.
But if you were to announce a long-term look, if that was to happen, it doesn't resolve long-term looks. I think the key's in the phrase long-term. Doesn't get us through the funding problems that we have at the moment.
No, I mean,
it may have to do both.
Look, you can argue there's never going to be enough money for the NHS,
yes,
and you could sustain that argument. You can also argue that the NHS is going to need accelerating amounts of money over years, because that's also evidently true.
Because of the demographics.
In terms of how the health system, preventative medicine, all of this sort of thing, there's a role for that which involves substantial transformation in NHS thinking too. So long term, on every level, that's the sort of change of thinking that's needed. And the government at the moment, well, to go back to the start of this conversation, the buck stops here and it stops now.
And despite what you critics might say is death by 1,000 cuts, or the government being assailed on all sides, Mrs May's still there.
She does. She is still
She
there.
survives.
Yes, she does.
Whatever's thrown at her. She keeps on going. Cabinet ministers come and go. Crises come and go. Her resilience, I'm beginning to think that even her critics are now beginning to rather admire her for her resilience, if for nothing else.
Look, I think you can safely say that is the case. A certain survivability, which is defying expect. I remember someone saying somewhere, maybe in a movie, about the old World War II Wellington bomber, whose chief characteristic was the ability to soak up flak without falling out of the sky. Theresa May, among many other things, seems to be our political Wellington bomber just now.
I have to get my old Airfix kit out. And we used to make these Wellington bombers on that. So on the Tory backbenches, although there's no enthusiasm for her, there's also no move now to get rid of her.
No, that has been so and still is.
It remains.
And for reasons we've discussed more than once, which is the sheer absence of a clear successor and the absence of any appetite on the backbenches to go into a leadership contest, which isn't the most flattering reason to carry on as Prime Minister, but it is a significant influence.
Do you agree with that?
Well, I think I've had the privilege of working quite closely with the Prime Minister, as I did with the last one. And what I see with her is somebody who's very tough and determined, has a real sense of public service. And I think that's what's driving her. She's not somebody who's going to walk away after a bad result, which we clearly had with the 2017 election. She wants to continue delivering for the country. And I think that's what gets her up every morning.
If, against all conventional opinion, Mrs May does survive, or this government survives through to 2022, which is when there has to be an election, I'll come back to that, because 5 minutes late, we're going to Prime Minister's questions.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. This morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Ephraim McKinnell.
The government must take responsibility for its role in the mess now left by Carillion. Thousands of staff face unemployment. SME suppliers face going bust, but I'm concerned for the 1,400 Carillion apprentices, some of whom I've met locally. It's not good enough to pass the buck to CITB. So will the Prime Minister guarantee today that every one of those apprentices will be able to complete their training and will be paid?
Well, can I say to the Honourable Lady that I recognise that, of course, this has been a difficult time for a number of people and concerned about their jobs, about public services and about their pensions. I want, first of all, if I may, Mr. Speaker, to provide reassurance to all employees who are working on public services for Carillion that they should continue to turn up to work, confident in the knowledge that they'll be paid for the work that they're providing. But, of course, the government is not running Carillion. The government is actually a customer of Carillion, and our focus has been on ensuring that we are providing the public services, that they are continuing to be provided uninterrupted, to reassure workers on those public services that they'll get paid, to reassure the pensioners and make sure the support's there for them. And yes, I'm coming on to the apprentices. But it is important that government is undertaking its role to ensure that the services it provides are continuing to be provided. And I can assure the Honourable Lady that we are aware of the issues around apprentices, and that's why the Minister with responsibility for that will be looking very carefully at what action can be taken.
Simon Hoare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What better way to start the year of engineering than to see manufacturing output at its highest level in a decade and productivity on the up? Can I invite my right honourable friend to commit and confirm her government to secure and support UK manufacturing and the important export it delivers?
Well, I'm very happy to give my honourable friend that commitment from the government. And he's absolutely right. It's very, very pleasing to see the figures that the ONS produced last week, which show that production has now grown for 8 months, the longest streak since 1994. Manufacturing output is at its highest since February 2008. And earlier this month, we saw that productivity growth has had its best quarter since 2011. That shows that our economy remains strong, that we're continuing to deliver secure, better-paid jobs, and we will continue to do that and supporting our manufacturing sector.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the last 6 months, the government has awarded more than £2 billion worth of contracts to Carillion. It did so even after the share price was in free fall and the company had issued profit warnings. Why did the government do that?
It might be helpful if I just set out for the right honourable gentleman that a company's profit warning means that it believes it will not make as much profit as it had expected to make. The government did. If it was the case that the government pulled out of contracts, or indeed private sector companies pulled out of contracts whenever a profit warning was issued, that would be the best way to ensure that companies failed and jobs were lost. It would also, for the government, raise real issues about providing continuing uninterrupted public services. Yes, we did, but we did recognise that it was a severe profit warning, and that's why we took action in relation to the contracts that we issued, and we ensured that all but one of those contracts was a joint venture. What does that mean? It means that there is another company available to step in and take over the contract. But I say to the right honourable gentleman, this wasn't just an issue of the government issuing contracts. Actually, we see that the Labour-run Welsh government issued a contract after the profit warning last July, and only last week, in the public sector, a public sector body announced that Carillion was their preferred bidder. Only last week. Was that the government? No, it was Labour-run Leeds City Council.
Mr. Speaker, for the record, Leeds have not signed a contract with Carillion. It's the government who've been handing out contracts. It's the government's responsibility to ensure Carillion is properly managed. between July, Mr. Speaker, between July and the end of last year, the share price of Carillion fell by 90%. 3 profit warnings were issued. Unbelievably, some contracts were awarded by the government even after the 3rd profit warning. Mr. Speaker, it looks like the government was handing Carillion public contracts either to keep the company afloat, which clearly hasn't worked, or it was just deeply negligent of the crisis that was coming down the line.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very happy to answer questions when the right honourable gentleman asks one. He didn't.
Mr. Speaker, I asked the government if they'd been negligent or not, and they clearly have been very negligent. Tory MPs might shout, Mr. Speaker, but the reality is, as of today, over 20,000 Carillion workers are very worried about their future, and for many of them, the only recourse tonight is to phone a DWP hotline. The frailties were well known. Hedge funds were betting against Carillion since 2015. RBS Bank, state-owned, making provision against Carillion last year. The government is supposed to protect public money through Crown representatives who are supposed to monitor these powerful corporations who get huge public contracts. So why, and this is a question that the Prime Minister needs to answer, and the question is this: why did the position of Crown representative to Carillion remain vacant during the crucial period of August to November when the profit warnings were being issued, the share price was in free fall, and many people were very worried?
I'm afraid I have to say to the right honourable gentleman, of course, a Crown... Can I say to the Shadow Foreign Secretary, I will indeed answer the question, but I know that she herself has praised Carillion in the past for the work that they've done. Can I say to the right honourable gentleman, yes, I mean, there is obviously now a Crown representative who's been fully involved in the government's response. Before the appointment of the Crown representative to replace the one that had previously been in place, the government chief commercial officer and the cabinet office director of markets and suppliers took over those responsibilities. So it was not the case that there was nobody from the government who was looking at these issues. That's a standard procedure. It ensured that there was oversight of Carillion's contracts with the government during the appointment process of the Crown representative.
Well, they clearly weren't looking very well. Carillion went into liquidation with debts we now understand to be £1.29 billion, a pension deficit of £600 million, and at the same time, this company was paying out ever-increasing shareholder dividends, wildly excessive bonuses to directors, and today, 8,000 Carillion workers on private sector contracts will no longer be paid. The chief executive is going to be paid, however, for another 10 months. One rule for the super-rich, another for everybody else. Can the Prime Minister assure the House today that not a single penny more will go to the chief executive or the directors of this company?
Can I first say to the right honourable gentleman that obviously this is a situation that is changing as decisions are being taken, but my understanding is that, that there are a number of private sector contractors who have now come to an agreement, and facilities management contractors who have come to an agreement with the official receiver that means that their workers will indeed continue to be paid. I think it's important that we say that that is the official receiver is doing their job and working with those companies. He's raised the issue of bonuses. services. And of course, people are concerned about this issue and and are rightly asking questions about it. That's why we're making sure that the official receiver's investigation into the business dealings of the company is fast-tracked, that it looks into the conduct not just of current directors but also of previous directors and their actions, and the official receiver does have the powers to ensure that in reviewing payments to executives, where those payments are unlawful or unjustified, he can take action to recover those payments. It's important that the official receiver is able to do their job. It's also important. Government's job is to ensure that public services continue to be provided, and that's what we're doing. The Right Honourable Gentleman said earlier in one of his questions it was the government's job to ensure that Carillion was properly managed. We were a customer of Carillion, not the manager of Carillion, and that's a very important difference. And it is also important, that we have protected taxpayers from an unacceptable bailout of a private company.
Mr. Speaker, when Carillion went into liquidation, many contractors were still unpaid. This company, Carillion, were notorious late payers, taking 120 days to pay, placing a huge burden on small companies, 4 times longer than the 30 days in the prompt payment code that Carillion had indeed themselves signed up to. So why did the government allow a major government contractor to get away with this? Will she commit to Labour's policy that abiding by the prompt payment code should be a basic requirement for all future government contracts?
Yes, of course, we look at the behaviour of companies that we contract with in relation to payments. This question of prompt payments has been one that has been brought up in this House, I have to say, for as long as I have been in this House, and efforts and work is always being done on it. But the Right Honourable Gentleman has raised an important point about the impact of Carillion's liquidation on small companies. That's why this morning the Business Secretary and the City Minister held a roundtable with the banks to discuss credit lines to small and medium-sized enterprises and to make clear that SMEs are not responsible for the collapse of Carillion. The Business Secretary has also held further roundtables today with representatives of small businesses, construction trade associations and trade unions, workers' unions, to make sure that we're on top of the potential effects on the wider supply chain. It is right that we look at those very carefully, that we take this action, and it's also right that we do put in place, through the DWP, support for any workers who do find themselves no longer employed as a result of this.
Corbyn.
It's a bit late for one subcontractor. Floratech, owed $800,000 by Carillion, have already had to make some of their staff redundant because of the collapse. But, Mr. Speaker, this isn't one isolated case of government negligence and corporate failure. It's a broken system. Under this government, Virgin and Stagecoach can spectacularly mismanage the East Coast Main Line and be let off a £2 billion payment. Capita and Atos can continue to wreck the lives through damaging disability assessments of many people with disabilities and win more government-funded contracts. G4S promised to provide security at the Olympics, failed to do so, and the Army had to step in and save the day. These corporations, Mr. Speaker, need to be shown the door. We need our public services provided by public employees with a public service ethos and a strong public oversight. As the ruins of Carillion lie around her, will the Prime Minister act to end this costly racket of the relationship between government and some of these companies?
I might first of all remind the Right Honourable Gentleman that a third of the Carillion contracts with the government were let by the Labour government. What we want is to provide good quality public services delivered at best value to the taxpayer. We're making sure in this case that public services continue to be provided, that the workers in those public services are supported and taxpayers are protected. But what Labour oppose isn't just a role for private companies in public services, but the private sector as a whole. The vast majority of people in this country in employment are employed by the private sector. But the Shadow Chancellor calls businesses the real enemy. Labour want the highest taxes in our peacetime history. Labour policies would cause a run on the pound. This is a Labour Party that has turned its back on investment, on growth, on jobs. A Labour Party that will always put politics before people.
Mr. Speaker. Absolutely. Mr. Speaker, can I thank the Prime Minister for visiting Cheam on Saturday, where she heard from local residents about the poor services provided by the complacent Lib Dem Council. People should not have to settle for second best. So will she agree with me that we need to unlock Sutton and indeed London's potential on May the 3rd by giving residents across London the opportunity to get great services and value for money by voting Conservative?
I was very happy to join my honourable friend on the doorsteps in Cheam and hear from people about the issues about Liberal Democrat services in Sutton and Cheam, particularly around the rubbish bins. I believe they're now up to 6 bins per household. I'm beginning to think they're trying to go for 1 bin for every Liberal Democrat member of Parliament. But he's absolutely right. The evidence is that Conservatives deliver better services at less cost to the council taxpayer. And while we're talking about cost to the council taxpayer, only last week Labour's then Fire Minister announced that Labour policy was to put council tax up on every average house, a typical home, by £320. People should know that a vote for Labour is a vote to pay more.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Prime Minister tell the House what official advice she has had on the impact of the UK economy from leaving the EU single market and when she requested any such advice?
Well, I have to say to the honourable gentleman that, of course, as we go through the Brexit negotiations, we are constantly looking at the impact that decisions that are taken will have on our economy. What we want to ensure is that we maintain good access, a good comprehensive free trade agreement with the European Union, while also, as leaving the European Union, we will be able to ensure that we get good free trade agreements with other parts of the world.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 19 months after the EU referendum, and the Prime Minister has not a shred of economic analysis on the impact of leaving the single market. On Monday, the Scottish Government published its second analysis paper, revealing some horrifying facts. Leaving the single market will cost each Scottish citizen up to £2,300 a year. How many jobs have to be lost, and how much of a hit will financial families take before the Prime Minister recognises the folly of leaving the single market?
The honourable gentleman asked me for economic analysis. Well, I'll give him some economic analysis. We saw the figures this morning for GDP growth in Scotland. In the third quarter, GDP in Scotland grew by 0.2%. In the rest of the United Kingdom, it grew by 0.4%. Over the last year, GDP in Scotland, under an SNP government in Scotland, grew by 0.6%. In the United Kingdom as a whole, it grew by 1.7%. My economic analysis, 1.7% is higher than 0.6%. You're better off with a Conservative government than an SNP one.
Sir Henry Bellingham.
Mr. Speaker, will the Prime Minister look at the case of my late constituent, Anne Banyard, who was badly injured by a fleeing shoplifter? She recently died, partly because of his injuries, at the young age of 70. Her claim to the Criminal Injuries Compensation Authority has been delayed, and the family fear that it may lapse completely. Will she join me and our local paper, the News, in supporting this case? And will she make it clear that the rights of victims should always be at the heart of our criminal policy.
My honourable friend is right to put the case for the rights of victims, and he's absolutely right that we should always remember victims. I'm very sorry to hear the case of his late constituent, Anne Banyard, and I know that the whole House will want to join me in offering condolences to her family in this tragic case. Of course, as my honourable friend knows, the Criminal Injuries Compensation Authority administers the Criminal Injuries Compensation Scheme, and it applies the rules independently of government. But I'm sure my right honourable friend, the Justice Secretary, will be happy to meet with my honourable friend to discuss this case.
Mr. Tanmanjeet Singh Desi.
Mr. Speaker, after the internationally embarrassing news of the Tory council leader from my neighbouring Windsor and Maidenhead and his deplorable attitude with regards to the homeless around the royal wedding, and the recent put-downs to the Prime Minister and our government by President Trump, can the Prime Minister confirm whether she actually wants an invite to be extended for the royal wedding and a state visit to the very stable genius from the US, who, by the way, Mr. Speaker, seems to be copying all the buzzwords from this not-so-strong and stable government?
Well, the honourable gentleman knows that we have a special and enduring relationship with the United States. An invitation to President Trump for a state visit has been extended. I have to say to the honourable gentleman, I'm not responsible for invitations for the royal wedding to take place. But he did reference the Royal Borough of Windsor and Maidenhead Council. I just think he should be aware that the Royal Borough has taken a number of actions to support vulnerable residents, including those who are homeless. The establishment of an emergency night shelter which is open 365 days a year, a day service attached to that providing support services to vulnerable residents, a comprehensive 7-day-a-week service for the homeless or those at risk of homelessness, and they applied the severe weather emergency protocol. They offered accommodation to, I think, 32 homeless people on the streets, of whom 21 took up that accommodation and 11 did not.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, cancer can strike anyone, no matter where they live in the UK. The Sunrise Appeal in Cornwall raised £3 million since the year 2000 to fund equipment and buildings for cancer care. But proposals by the NHS could see radiotherapy services move from Cornwall to Devon. This would see many constituents having to travel hundreds of miles to access treatment many times a week. These proposals are unacceptable to my constituents and the vast majority of people in Cornwall. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that travel time should be taken into account when making these decisions, and will she join me in encouraging the people of Cornwall to respond to the NHS consultation?
Well, my honourable friend raises an important point, and we do want to ensure that patients get the best cancer services. We want to see them getting access to treatment and ensuring that they get that in a timely fashion. And of course, the length of time it takes them to travel to that treatment is an important issue here. That's why we are establishing radiotherapy networks that will review access issues and service provision on a regular basis and address any shortcomings in the area, and that's backed up by £130 million for new and upgraded radiotherapy machines. But he's absolutely right that these decisions should be taken primarily at a local level, and I would join him in encouraging the people in Cornwall to respond to the consultation.
Mr. Speaker, last week my constituent Carol's son had a mental health crisis. He was admitted to the nearest available psychiatric adult bed in West Sussex, a 450-mile round trip from his home and family in Manchester. The lack of mental health beds is a national crisis and scandal. So when will the Prime Minister turn her warm words on mental health into action to solve the crisis?
Well, I can say to the honourable gentleman, obviously I'm sorry to hear the experience of his constituent. We are turning the words that we've put on in terms of the priority of mental health into action. Is there more for us to do? Yes, that's why we're continuing to put an emphasis on this. We do see more people being able to access mental health services every day. We've increased the number of people having access to therapies. We've increased the funding that is available for mental health. There is more for us to do, but we're putting more money in and we're taking more action on mental health than any previous government.
Sir Desmond Swain.
Order! The right honourable gentleman is extremely alert. And I want order, and I'm alert to what he's going to say. Sir Desmond.
A question keeps me awake at night. How will companies be encouraged to follow her lead in the way that Iceland has done?
No, I'm very pleased to say that we've seen Iceland this week making a commitment to be plastic-free. We've seen other companies actually making commitments to ensure that any plastics they use are recyclable in a number of years. And I'm very happy to join my honourable friend in saying we will be encouraging companies to follow Iceland's lead. We'll also be consulting on how the tax system or the introduction of charges could further reduce the amount of waste we create. And we're launching a new plastics innovation fund backed up by additional funding that the government's investing in research and development to ensure that we do really reduce the amount of plastic that is used and leave this planet, this land, in an environment in a better state than we found it.
We can all learn about brevity, myself included, from the right honourable gentleman. David Linden.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Margot Laird has profound mental health difficulties. She was put onto universal credit in January 2016 and subsequently received a 276-day sanction. A judge recently ruled that that sanction was wrong and it's been overturned. Will the Prime Minister agree to look into Margot Laird's case? But above all, will she apologise to Margot?
I'm sorry to hear the case that the honourable gentleman has set out. I'm very happy to ensure that that case is properly looked into.
Andrea Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Following Transport for the North's announcement on Northern Powerhouse Rail, will the Prime Minister confirm our government's commitment to investing in northern transport infrastructure and ensuring that the Northern Powerhouse materialises?
Well, I'm very happy to give that commitment to the Northern Powerhouse and to giving the great cities across the north the transport infrastructure that they need in order to be able to develop that northern powerhouse. We are spending a record £13 billion to transform transport across the north. We've made Transport for the North the first ever statutory sub-national transport body and backed that up by £260 million of government funding. They've published their draft strategic plan for consultation, and I would hope that all members with an interest in this issue would engage in that consultation and make sure their views and their constituents' views are heard.
Carol Monaghan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. His Holiness Pope Francis has this week condemned hostility to migrants, saying communities across Europe must open themselves without prejudice to the rich diversity of immigrants. As a committed Christian, would the Prime Minister agree with Pope Francis that hostility to migrants is a sin?
What I say to the honourable lady is that this country has a fine record over not just decades but centuries of welcoming refugees and ensuring that people can come to this country and make their home in this country, and that is what we will continue to do.
Goldsmith.
John Warboys is likely to be one of the worst sex attackers our country has ever known. When he was in court, he denied his guilt. He was continuing to deny his guilt up until 2 years ago. He dismissed his crimes as banter, and only last year he was deemed too dangerous to be put into open release conditions. The short sentence he has served is an insult to his victims and shows a contempt for justice. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that the decision must now be judicially reviewed and that the police should immediately reassess those cases which were not tried in court?
Yes. Well, I thank my honourable friend for raising this, and this is a case that has rightly raised deep concern among the public, but also across all members across this House. As my honourable friend will know, the Parole Board is rightly independent of government, and even in sensitive cases such as this, we must ensure that that independence is maintained and we don't prejudice decisions. But although they've decided to approve his release with stringent licence conditions, my right honourable friend, the Justice Secretary, has made clear that he is taking legal advice on the possibility of a judicial review of this decision. And it is also the case that the Justice Secretary has said he will be conducting a review to look at options for change in this issue of transparency of decisions by the Parole Board, because public protection is our top priority, and I think often people are concerned when they see decisions of the parole board being taken and they're not aware of the reasons behind that. There may be limits to what can be done, but I think it's right that we look into this case and question this issue of transparency.
Dr. Lisa Cameron.
Many thanks, Mr. Speaker. My constituent informed me that she had been repeatedly raped and beaten by her ex-partner, requiring an injunction. Much to her horror, her bank would not close their joint account unless she attended with the perpetrator. When banks are left to their discretion, women's lives are being put at risk. Will the Prime Minister ensure policy to protect survivors is included in the pending domestic violence bill?
Yes, well, the Honourable Lady clearly raises a very distressing case, and we want to ensure that we do give proper support to all those who have been subject to domestic violence or to abuse of the kind that the Honourable Lady has referred to. The Home Secretary will be issuing a consultation shortly on the proposed domestic violence legislation. This will be an opportunity for issues such as this to be raised.
Damien Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A brutal attack occurred in my constituency over the weekend where Cassie Hayes, a young woman, tragically died. Would the Prime Minister extend her sympathies to the family of Cassie, as well as paying tribute to the hard work of the emergency services who attended the scene?
Can I say to my honourable friend, obviously he told me about this very distressing case last night, and this is a horrific case, and I do extend my sympathies, and I'm sure the whole House extend their sympathies and condolences to Cassie's family and friends at this tragic death that has occurred. I also congratulate the emergency services on the action that they have taken, but also I think from the description my honourable friend gave to me last night, I think we should also have some thought and care for all those who will sadly witnesses to this particular incident through no fault of their own other than happening to be in a particular premises at a particular time.
Mr. David Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will be aware that Northern Ireland has not had a government now for over a year. Decisions need to be taken to protect our health service, education and local communities. Does the Prime Minister agree that in the absence of a government being formed, it is imperative that her government takes the decision to appoint direct rule ministers as soon as possible so that a budget can be put forward to deal with this urgent problem?
We are committed to re-establishing a fully functioning, inclusive, devolved administration that works for everyone in Northern Ireland. I don't underestimate the challenges that remain involved here, but we still believe that a way forward can be found and an agreement can be reached. And I would say it's imperative, therefore, that the parties re-engage in intensive discussions aimed at resolving the outstanding issues so that the Assembly can meet and an executive can be formed. We do recognise, however, that we have a responsibility to ensure political stability and good governance in Northern Ireland. Obviously, as I say, our priority is on ensuring that we can work with the parties to re-establish the devolved government in Northern Ireland. But we recognise the need to ensure that Northern Ireland can continue to operate and that public services can continue to be provided.
Thomas.
For her earlier response to my colleague and member for North Cornwall. The NHS England and this government are investing a further £130 million into radiotherapy treatment for rare and less common cancers. Can she confirm and reassure my constituents that there is no need for existing good radiotherapy services in Sunset Centre to be moved in order to deliver this cancer treatment for rare cancers?
Well, as I said in relation to the earlier question from my honourable friend, we do recognise the importance of ensuring that people have access to these treatments that they require, and we do recognise the issues that people sometimes face in relation to travelling to those the centres where these services are available. This is primarily a decision to be taken at local level, and as I did earlier, I would encourage people to take part in the consultation, to respond to the consultation, so that local views can truly be heard and taken into account.
Thank you,
Mr. Speaker. My constituent, Chris Robinson, has to wait 52 weeks for her pain relief treatment instead of the 18 weeks that a properly funded NHS would deliver. How much longer will it take for the Prime Minister to sort things out?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman that we are putting more money, as he knows, into the National Health Service. In the autumn budget, the Chancellor of the Exchequer put a further £2.8 billion into the National Health Service. But if we are looking at the issues of treatment across the National Health Service, we have to be very clear that while Labour's answer is always just more money, this is about ensuring that all hospitals across the NHS are operating and acting in accordance with best practice. We have world-class hospitals in our NHS. We want to ensure they are all world-class.
Speaker, I understand that London has been mentioned as a potential host to the Bayeux Tapestry. Given that visitors to London who wish to see two sides chucking things at each other are already very well catered for by the gallery in this chamber, could I ask the Prime Minister to put in a very good word for Battle Abbey in East Sussex, where viewers can not only see the tapestry but look through the window and see the rolling East Sussex countryside, where sadly the Normans gave the Saxons 6 of the best.
Can I say to my honourable friend, I think it is very significant that the Bayeux Tapestry is going to be coming to the United Kingdom and that people are going to be able to see this. I hear the bid that he has put in. I have to say to him that from a sedentary position on the front bench, my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary and member for Hastings, also put in a bid for this particular issue. I'm sure we'll be looking very carefully to ensure that the maximum number of people can take benefit of seeing this tapestry.
Alex Norris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister pledged to consign slavery to the history books. However, the National Audit Office says the Home Office hasn't set out how a reduction will be measured. The Home Office doesn't set clear anti-slavery activity. The Home Office doesn't know what activity is going on across government. And the Home Office doesn't monitor business compliance with the Modern Slavery Act. Is the Prime Minister satisfied with that analysis of her flagship policy, and what action will the government be taking?
It is this government, and I as Home Secretary, that introduced the Modern Slavery Act. It is this government that has improved the response to victims, the response from police in catching perpetrators. We see more cases now being brought to prosecution than we have done before. We see more victims willing and able to come forward and having the confidence to come forward. Have we dealt with the problem? Of course there are still problems out there. But we want to ensure, as my right honourable friend, the International Development Secretary said earlier in international development questions, not just that we take action here in the United Kingdom, that we work with countries where the women are being trafficked into this country, and we also work with other countries to eliminate modern slavery across the world, and that's exactly what we're doing.
Tory Apprentice.
Members across this House have sung for Syrians. Last week in Idlib, a clinic and a kindergarten that we support were bombed by Syrian government destroyers. Will the Prime Minister join me in paying tribute to the bravery of the staff of the Hands Up Foundation who continue to work there, and also in reassuring ordinary Syrians that in the 7th year of this terrible war, that we haven't forgotten them?
Well, can I say to my honourable friend, she has been a great champion for charities working in Syria, and particularly for the Singing for Syrians. And I am very happy to join her in praising the bravery of all those working for the Hands Up Foundation, but also others working for other charities in the region doing valuable and important work. We continue to make every effort to achieve our goals in Syria. That is, of course, defeating the scourge of Daesh, but it's also ensuring that we achieve a political settlement that ends the suffering and that provides stability for all Syrians and the wider region. And we continue to provide significant humanitarian assistance, £2.46 billion to date.
Hussein.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Prime Minister tell me why the failed Wakefield Academy Trust was allowed to take over schools in Bradford, even though there were concerns as far back as 2015 around the trust? And can she give me assurances here today that the hundreds of thousands of pounds taken from schools in my constituency, one of the poorest in the country, will be returned immediately?
We, of course, have a priority to make sure that children across the country receive a great education, whether they're in the north or the south, and of course 7 of our 12 opportunity areas in providing that support are in the north and the Midlands. That's the front line of our approach to tackling inequality in education outcomes. we are taking forward. He's concerned about northern schools. We are taking forward recommendations from the Northern Powerhouse Schools Strategy. And as regards funding, we're putting record levels of funding into our schools and have announced increased funding for our schools over the next 2 years.
I and local charities will be holding a meeting to discuss how we can fight the problem of loneliness in our community. At the national level, what is the Prime Minister doing to implement the important recommendations of the Joe Cox Commission on Loneliness?
Well, my honourable friend has raised a very important issue, and he's absolutely right that for too many people, loneliness is the sad reality of their modern life, and we know loneliness has an impact not only on people's mental health but also on their physical health as well. I'm very pleased that later today I'll be hosting a reception for the Joe Cox Foundation looking at this issue of loneliness in number 10 Downing Street. I think the work that Joe Cox started, that has been continued by my honourable friend, the member for South Ribble, and the honourable lady who's for Leeds West, thank you, is a very important work. And I'm pleased to say that the government has appointed a Minister for Loneliness. I think this is an important step forward. It shows that we do recognise, of course there's more to do, but it shows that we recognise the importance of this issue, and I pay tribute to all those in this House who've championed this issue.
Mr. Speaker, universal credit was meant to remove benefit traps, but the Department for Education wants to base eligibility for free school meals on an income threshold. So if a family earning just below the threshold gets a small pay rise or an increase in hours, they'll immediately lose the benefit of the school meals and end up much worse off. It's a far worse benefit trap than anything in the old benefit system. Surely one department should not be torpedoing the aim of getting rid of benefit traps. The government's aims in this way.
The right honourable gentleman knows that we believe that universal credit is a better system. It's a simpler system than the benefits it replaced, and also it encourages people to get into workplace and ensures that the more they earn, the more they keep. But our proposals mean that once universal credit is fully rolled out, actually we will see 50,000 more children eligible for free school meals than under the old system.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the great speech that the Prime Minister gave last Thursday on the environment? It is right that the Prime Minister, and indeed this party, supports companies that promote sustainable growth. But does the Prime Minister also agree with me that any commercial development must take now into account the needs of the environment?
Well, can I say to my honourable friend, I thank him for the comments he made about the speech, but what it was about was the 25-year environment plan that the government has published. I think this is very important steps that we have taken to ensure that we do leave our environment in a better state than when we came into it. I also agree with him that actually all too often people see economic growth or protection of the environment as opposites. They are not. And it is absolutely possible for us to ensure we are protecting our environment while producing that economic growth, not least because of the innovative technologies that we can be developing to ensure that we are protecting our environment.
Liz Savile-Roberts.
The people of Wales have been taking back control since 1999, but the EU withdrawal bill will put our powers back under lock and key in Westminster. My colleague Stephen Lewis AM is today proposing a Welsh continuity bill to ensure our powers are at liberty. When this Plaid Cymru bill wins a majority in our Assembly, will the Prime Minister support it and respect Wales's sovereignty?
I say to the honourable lady that her portrayal of what is happening in the EU withdrawal bill is simply wrong. We are working with the devolved administrations to ensure that we deal with the issues that have been raised around Clause 11 and the question of powers that need to remain at UK level to ensure our internal market, but powers will be devolved and extra powers will be devolved to the devolved administrations. We continue to work with the devolved administrations on this, and we will be bringing forward amendment to Clause 11 in the House of Lords, but we want to ensure that that meets the needs of the UK and of the devolved administrations.
Thank you. Order.
Well, we were right. I don't often say that.
Mr. Corbyn did go, and Carillion, the bankrupt, now being liquidated construction company, and he wanted to know from the Prime Minister why, when it was clear that the company was in serious trouble, that the government continued to dole out contracts to it. There were times when you may have thought he'd been watching the first half hour of the Daily Politics. Such was his line of questioning, or at least some of his staff may well have been. I'm not quite sure how much further we got on with this, but it finished up really with Mr. Corbyn attacking almost the very concept of outsourcing to the private sector public services and perhaps even public construction contracts. That bit's still not yet quite clear. And Mrs. May giving a defence of the private sector in the provision of public services. A clear, in a sense, ideological divide there, if you like. So let's discuss all this with the Cabinet Office Minister, Oliver Dowden, Shadow Business Minister Chi Onwurah, and John Pienaar, of course, is here too. John, not sure we learned anything new from that exchange.
No. Jeremy Corbyn was spoilt for choice for attack lines, a number of which I think had a fair chance of striking a chord with the public looking in. The awarding of quite large paid and severance bonuses and deals to past executives who were there just a few months ago while this company was going down. A lot of people will have a sympathy with that line of attack. The question posed by Jeremy Corbyn, the one you were discussing earlier on, why were contracts being handed over to this company when it was in such trouble? We had from Theresa May most of the time a fairly defensive dead back to a lot of this, although she did answer that latter question quite bluntly, maybe more bluntly than Oliver felt able to answer earlier on the show, which he said if we had not handed these contracts over because there'd been profit warnings, the company would have gone down the plug that much sooner, and those jobs would have gone, but which still left other questions unanswered. If that's the complete answer, next time, will there be another company teetering on the brink, which is still given contracts in this way and the risk of a failure barely addressed? The answer to that surely is going to have to be no, and an answer is going to have to come out of the reviews that are taking place now. But they ended up with basic ideology, didn't they, which is where it starts.
But Oliver Dowden, the Prime Minister said they couldn't pull out of contracts because that would have made certain that the company would fail. But the issue is not pulling out of contracts. The issue was continuing to grant new contracts to the company, even though it was clearly in trouble. That's a different matter.
Yes, and in respect of that, as we discussed earlier, we structured them in such a way that they were joint ventures. We were stringent on the joint ventures. What you've seen subsequently is that the other parties have stepped up and there's been no interruption to public service delivery. And I think that John raised a very important point at the beginning about jobs. In relation to jobs, anyone who's working in the public sector part, that's 40%, their jobs are secure because the government is going to pay out on those contracts. And we now know this morning from the official receiver that in relation to the private sector service contracts, most of those will continue, so people can be secure in that section.
But they won't be paid.
They will continue to be paid because those contracts are going to continue to be honoured because they'll continue to be delivered on.
If you're an SME, small contractor that Carillion gets the big contract, then hands out hundreds, if not thousands, of smaller contracts, and for the last 120 days you've been working away and you put your bill in as a small contractor, the company's now in liquidation, that private company won't get paid.
Well, in respect, remember, Carillion's business has two parts, 40% with the public sector and 60% with the private sector. If you just, because it is important to this point, in relation to the 40% that's with the public sector, through the official receiver, those contracts will be honoured and that will go all the way down the supply chain. So those people will be fine. In relation to the contracts that are in the private sector, almost all of the service contracts will continue to be honoured because, for example, if you have a cleaning contract, the office still needs to be cleaned. So those will be delivered upon. Now, clearly, in relation to the remaining part, which is in the private sector, that will be treated as in any other private sector liquidation. The official receiver will seek to recover as much as he possibly can, and they will be creditors to that company. So the amount that they get paid depends on that liquidation process.
But so far, the latest guesstimate was that they'll get a penny in the pound.
Well, it's impossible to speculate until the
official
receiver
that was looking at the amount of, because the company has almost nothing on its balance sheet.
Nothing.
So there are no assets to dig into. It had £29 million of cash in the bank, and that's about it. I take your point that if you're a cleaning company to which the cleaning has been subcontracted, you will probably be able to continue to do that. Exactly where the money will come from, I'm not sure. But if I've just submitted a bill for the past 120 days and I've not yet been paid, I won't get paid, will I?
It's an important point in respect of the cleaning company. Those people will likely to be 2P'd over. As you know, 2P means that you continue in the same terms. And
but that doesn't. I understand that.
And
others will take the contract.
I'd like to address your point, the other point that you're making, which is very legitimate, which is in relation to how much those people who are essentially creditors, they carried out work. Remember, this is purely in the private sector, but they've not been paid yet. As you know, in any liquidation, the process for that is the official receiver seeks to recover as much as possible, and then they will get paid out accordingly. But that is absolutely no different to any other situation with a private company.
Mr. Corbyn at the end had quite a generalised attack on the whole concept of outsourcing certain services to the public sector. Is it Labour's position now that all of that will stop?
So, I worked in the private sector for 20 years before coming into Parliament. You do not outsource what is your core competence in the private sector. That is, and here the core competence, although Olivia and the Prime Minister don't seem to recognise this, of the public sector is to deliver public services. So what we are saying is that the public sector, and Jeremy said that quite clearly, and we've seen with Virgin, we've seen with G4S, that the public sector should be delivering public services.
So when it comes to, say, the private provision of public services, for example, rubbish collection, which is now largely in private hands, is it Labour's position to end that?
It's Labour's position that public services, so where possible, and we can't do everything at once, and we will need to look at what the cost implications are, but where possible, public services should be delivered by the public sector, and I think that's quite clear.
Including
we need to build the capacity.
Hospital laundry?
We need to build the capacity, and we need to recognise
all of that should be done by the state.
The private sector can add capacity and resilience. But in public services, people, I think, expect that their government should deliver the public services.
I get the principle. I'm trying to work out what it means.
To say that the private sector... No, but because you are making the private sector the public sector, and that's why you're saying that it's nothing to do with the government.
The reason why you have this contracting out, which, as you say, many companies do, the reason why they do it, and the reason why the government does is because, for example, in relation to cleaning, you have companies that have that expertise. The effect of that is that you save money for the taxpayer, which means you have more money to pay for your schools and your hospitals.
We're going to have to stop doing that.
That's all, folks.
I've been